Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're diving straight in to demystify the incredibly strict deterministic geometry of the 3D golden-rhombic jewel. You know, if you've ever wondered how the mathematical blueprints behind complex computer vision reconstructions are actually preserved so future systems can read them, well, you're in exactly the right place. We're going to be looking specifically at the Stage JR Readability Repair Edition.
So here's our roadmap for today's breakdown. We've got 6 parts. First, a blueprint for reconstruction. Then, anatomy of the jewel. Third, the strict laws of adjacency. Fourth, scaling up, tessellation evidence. Fifth, the Stage F pilot. And we'll wrap up with preserving a digital legacy. Let's get right into it.
All right, Section 1, a blueprint for reconstruction.
So, why does this packet even exist in the first place? Well, this quote right here really hits the nail on the head. It was created to preserve the actual structural jewel system, so another AI, another programmer, can rebuild it without archaeological excavation. Honestly, this is basically a digital time capsule. It's a highly structured blueprint built intentionally to prevent future data loss.
Which brings us to what a readability repair actually means. The previous packet? It was structurally correct for sure, but the tables were just way too cramped for any real-world use. The absolute key takeaway here is that this edition doesn't introduce any new geometry, and it definitely doesn't make any medical claims. It simply takes the existing rigid rules and makes the whole architecture legible.
Moving right along to Section 2, anatomy of the jewel.
Now, focus in on this primitive shape. I want to be super clear here. This is definitely not your generic, everyday cube. What we're dealing with is a 6-faced golden rhombic display primitive. Notice the specific slants and dimensions. Every single aspect of this is governed by strict mathematical laws. This is the core foundation that the entire system relies on.
And those mathematical laws are, frankly, absolute. Every single major face is governed by the golden ratio. The short diagonal is exactly 1, and the long diagonal is phi, which is defined perfectly as 1.618,033,988,749,895. And yeah, they are literally that obsessively specific. It's this extreme precision that makes the unit completely deterministic and reconstructible. Again, the source text is aggressively clear. It's not a cube, it's not a generic icon, and it makes absolutely no medical claims.
To keep all this geometry organized, the system relies on something called the 6-face canon. We're going to constantly refer back to this precise canon because these specific colors, codes, and designations, they never change. For example, FT0 is always the top or crown facet, and it is always yellow. BBP3 is the bottom or receiver, and it's always purple. These aren't just pretty design choices. They are structural identifiers that are absolutely vital for reconstruction.
Which brings us to Section 3, the strict laws of adjacency.
Let's map out the corrected side lineage law. Notice this really intense color division. The left side mandates a strictly blue and green combination. That's FLB2 and BLG4. Meanwhile, the right side strictly, absolutely requires red and orange, FRR1 and BRO5.
And you know, this distinction is incredibly unforgiving. The rules of physical adjacency dictate that red has to share a specific edge with orange, and blue has to share an edge with green. What happens if you try to mix, say, a right side red with a left side green? Boom. The system flags a forbidden wrong side adjacency, and your reconstruction fundamentally fails. No way around it.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit for Section 4, scaling up, tessellation evidence.
The packet outlines this really distinct visual progression. This timeline is crucial because it proves that these deterministic keys don't just break down when things get bigger. We go from single master units in Stage A, through canonical style variants in Stage BR, all the way into massive superdense geometric fields in Stage C. Just watch how perfectly the structural integrity holds up here in Stage BR. Even as the field expands, those canonical colors map out exactly like they're supposed to. The yellow tops are perfectly aligned, the red and orange rights stick together, and the blue and green lefts remain paired. The foundational rules are easily supporting this growing cluster. And then, we hit Stage C. Just look at how incredibly dense the field becomes in this boundary wire structure. It's massive, right? But despite the thousands of units interacting, the system maintains its perfect mathematical orientation. It doesn't just collapse into a pile of scattered confetti, it stays a highly organized, deterministic matrix.
All right, Section 5, the Stage F pilot.
Okay, 40,451.
Let that number sink in for a second. That is the total grand count of proof render pilot instances executed across just 3 pages in the Stage F pilot. And get this, that's just a proof of concept working toward an ultimate target of over 1.6 million display instances. The sheer scale of this reconstruction is literally mind-blowing.
Seeing these rigid, deterministic arrays overlaid directly onto human brain MRI scans, it's visually stunning, isn't it? The computer vision system is mapping raw math over incredibly complex organic imagery. But this exact overlap brings us to what is arguably the most vital, non-negotiable rule of this entire system.
They call it the density covenant, and we absolutely must reiterate this. This computer vision reconstruction does not diagnose, interpret, or medically alter the underlying MRI data in any way, shape, or form. The geometric units, they're purely logical render instances. They are display targets for geometric reconstruction and nothing more.
Finally, Section 6, Preserving a Digital Legacy. To wrap things up, the packet leaves us with a final validation checklist. Ticking off these exact criteria is what confirms the readability repair was safe, successful, and completely true to the original vision. It verifies the canon is intact, the visual plates are clear, the source files are 100% untouched, and, crucially, absolutely zero medical processing happened.
So it all comes down to this. When we build complex, deterministic systems, how do we ensure the AI of tomorrow can actually decipher the intricate geometry of today? Relying on guesswork just isn't going to cut it. Structuring our blueprints with unyielding mathematical precision, like we see with the golden-rhombic jewel, really reminds us why explicitly defining our rules is so absolutely crucial for the systems of the future. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Stay curious and keep learning.
Welcome back to another explainer. So today we are opening up what I can really only describe as a digital time capsule. We're diving into a document that is so meticulously structured and honestly so incredibly specific in its esoteric geometry that it feels way less like a software manual and a lot more like some kind of alien blueprint. It's known as the reconstruction packet for the 3D golden-rhombic jewel. And as we're going to see, the author left absolutely nothing to chance, literally zero.
Just get a load of this quote from the opening pages. The purpose is to preserve the actual structural jewel system so another AI, another programmer, or Dylan months from now can rebuild it without archaeological excavation. I mean, you kind of have to admire the absolute borderline paranoia of the programmer here, right? They're leaving behind this hyper-specific code so it can be flawlessly resurrected in the future without someone having to sift through the digital dirt to figure it out.
All right, so here is our agenda for today. We'll start with the reconstruction packet itself, then move to the anatomy of the jewel, check out the strict laws of adjacency, explore tessellation and tiling, dive into the dense field renders, and finally wrap up with a crucial distinction: geometry, not medicine.
Okay, let's jump right into Section 1, the reconstruction packet.
Now, this document explicitly defines itself as a geometric, deterministic, computer vision reconstruction guide. Interestingly, the previous version of this packet actually had the exact same structure, but the data tables were just way too cramped to be practical. So this readability repair edition was pushed out purely to improve usability, all while completely preserving what the author calls the strict canon of the system. Imagine being so fiercely dedicated to your digital architecture that you issue a patch simply to guarantee the geometry survives the test of time perfectly intact. It's really a beautifully obsessive level of commitment.
Moving right along to Section 2, Anatomy of the Jewel. Let's look at the actual building blocks.
So this entire system obeys one uncompromising mathematical rule: phi, the golden ratio. It's roughly 1.618. Every single major face of the shape we're about to unpack is governed by this golden rhombus rule. Basically, the long diagonal is exactly phi, and the short diagonal is exactly 1. No exceptions.
Which brings us to the core definition. The 3D golden-rhombic jewel is a 6-faced, deterministic display primitive. And the author goes way out of their way to explicitly state what this is not. It's not some generic icon, it's not a medical claim, and above all else, and they make this abundantly clear, it is not a cube. It is a highly specific, reconstructible primitive.
And every single one of those 6 faces has a strict identity. They call this the 6-face canon. Notice just how unyielding this lineage is. FTJ0 is mapped exclusively to the top yellow crown. BPP3 is permanently locked to the bottom purple receiver. Every single facet gets a distinct code name, an exact RGB color value, a numerical facet ID,
and a designated lineage. There is zero room for interpretation here.
Okay, let's dive into this and actually visualize the 3D golden-rhombic jewel itself. You can easily map that strict color canon directly onto the shape. You've got the yellow crown right on top, the red and blue faces sitting in the front, and then the green and orange wrapping around the back sides. Every single color and facet assignment is rigidly locked into this deterministic system.
All right, Section 3, the strict laws of adjacency. This is where things get really fascinating.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how the packet splits the interactions into strict lineages. It's basically the physics engine of this world. Look at the dichotomy here. The left side law dictates that the blue and green faces must always stay on the left. Meanwhile, the right side law demands that the red and orange faces stay strictly on the right.
And because of these strict lineages, certain connections are just flat out forbidden. This is an absolutely unbreakable rule. If you ever mix them up, you trigger a forbidden wrong side adjacency. The right side red must never, ever pair with the left side green, and the left side blue can never pair with the right side orange. Doing so would completely corrupt the geometric DNA of the whole structure.
In fact, the document actually lists out severe forbidden visual failures just to ensure this system is treated as precise, deterministic code and not just arbitrary digital art. You can't use generic cube icons. You can't just scatter these things around like digital marker confetti. They aren't decorations, you know? They are deterministic units meant to multiply. Even rendering a single, isolated jewel on its own is considered a total failure.
Which perfectly sets up Section 4, tessellation and tiling.
Let's move to the Stage A master unit tiling evidence and see how this actually builds. This is where those strict adjacency laws we just talked about are put to the test. You can see the master units snapping together perfectly, completely obeying those strict orientation and lineage constraints so they connect precisely at the correct golden rhombic angles.
As the rules iterate, the clusters start growing into these stage BR corrected style variants. The jewels are forming these incredibly intricate, interwoven plates. They aren't just stacking on top of each other, they're actually nesting, creating these pristine chains of geometric structure that are, honestly, just incredibly satisfying to look at.
And then we get this, which brilliantly illustrates the leap into full three-dimensional space. This is the Stage C tessellation slice sheet. The jewels have clustered together into a massive, undeniable 3D volume grid. It's no longer just a flat tiling. It has evolved into a full-blown structural matrix.
And that matrix takes us to Section 5, the dense field renders.
Just look at this striking visual crescendo. These are the Stage C and F dense field overlays. The full tessellation, perfectly respecting every single color canon and adjacency law, has grown to encompass an entire volume. And in this specific evidence, the geometry is overlaid directly onto medical MRI scans of a human brain. It's mapping a rigidly perfect digital architecture right over organic human anatomy. Now, you might be wondering, why overlay this mathematically pristine grid onto something as inherently messy as biology?
Well, to put the sheer scale of what we are looking at into perspective, the Stage F pilot-proof render contains exactly 40,451 logical render instances of the jewel. Think about that for a second. That is over 40,000 individually plotted, deterministically placed geometric units.
And those units aren't just thrown in there willy-nilly. They are meticulously allocated into highly specialized roles. In just one single pilot page, over 11,000 units are dedicated to the dense field. Over 1,500 form the boundary wire locking it all in, and hundreds more act as sparse or emphasis markers. It's literally like a digital ant colony. Every single one of those 40,451 units has a specific job to do.
Which brings us to our final point in Section 6, geometry, not medicine.
So the crucial point to take away is this. The packet is totally unyielding in its doctrine. These dense fields are purely display primitives. The document repeats time and time again that it does not diagnose, interpret, classify, or medically explain the MRI data beneath it. It doesn't modify the source MRI in any way. The jewel is strictly a computer vision target. It's an architectural display layer floating above the biology, and it remains entirely separate from it.
We've explored the 3D golden-rhombic jewel, its strict color canons, its unbreakable adjacency laws, and its awe-inspiring dense fields. But going through all this kind of leaves us with a lingering thought. If this incredibly rigid, deeply esoteric structure was so perfectly preserved for another AI to rebuild in the future, what other deterministic architectural marvels might be hiding deeper within its code? Well, that's something to think about. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the geometry around you.
Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're unpacking something that is just absolutely fascinating and honestly pretty esoteric. We're looking at a document called the 3D golden-rhombic jewel reconstruction packet, specifically the Stage JR Readability Repair Edition. Okay, let's dive into this. What we've got here isn't your everyday document. It's more like a set of unbending rules for a digital universe. It's a highly technical, deterministic computer vision guide that is both mathematically beautiful and literally as uncompromising as physical gravity. Let's unpack it step by step. Now, look at these dense, colorful geometric structures mapped perfectly over the human brain MRI. Your immediate assumption is probably, oh, this has to be some kind of advanced medical diagnostic tool, right? I mean, it looks like it's scanning or measuring neurological data. And honestly, it's a completely natural conclusion to draw when you see intricate geometry layered so deliberately over human anatomy like this. You totally expect it to be a medical report. But wait, here's the massive subversion right at the very top of the source document, and it completely reframes the whole thing. The packet explicitly states it does not diagnose, interpret, classify, or medically explain MRI data. It doesn't even modify the source data. So what are we actually looking at? We're looking at a deterministic visual primitive. It's a purely abstract computer vision rendering system. The MRI isn't the subject at all. It's literally just a canvas to prove the geometry. Crazy, right? To tackle this, we've structured this explainer into 6 parts. First, we'll look at the golden-rhombic mystery, then dissect the anatomy of a jewel. We'll follow up with the 6-phase canon, the laws of adjacency, scaling the architecture, and finally, reconstruction, not diagnosis. Section 1. Anatomy of a jewel, the base primitive. Let's strip away the complexity and look at the fundamental building block. This base unit is officially called the 3D golden-rhombic jewel. It's defined as a 6-faced deterministic display primitive. So the crucial point is that it is entirely governed by the golden ratio. The rules state that for each major face, the long diagonal equals phi, which is exactly 1.618033988749885, and the short diagonal equals 1. Why does this matter? Well, using the golden ratio ensures that when these shapes are multiplied later on, they stack perfectly together without a single gap or error. It is literally a model of absolute mathematical perfection and rigidity. Check out the specific vertices and labels mapped out here. The text actually goes out of its way to establish what this is not. It is explicitly not a generic cube. It's not just a standard icon. Instead, it's a highly specific, mathematically reconstructible geometric unit, designed to exist with absolutely zero ambiguity. Section 2. The 6th phase canon, absolute geometric doctrine. The language here gets pretty intense. We're talking words like canon and doctrine. Every single face of the jewel is mandated by this canon. You've got FTY0, which is the top yellow facet. FRR1 is front right red. FLB2 is front left blue. And down at the base, BBP3 is the back bottom purple, which acts as the receiver. And these aren't just casual suggestions. The document assigns them precise, unbending RGB values, like exactly 255, 215, 0 for yellow. No exceptions. This really highlights the obsessive structural organization required by the protocol. It's like the physical laws of this digital universe. As you see this master unit spinning through space to demonstrate its angles, just think about the sheer precision required here. Every abstract vertex, mathematically labeled from O through to ABC, absolutely must align perfectly in 3D space. It is a deterministic puzzle piece. It's completely inflexible in how it's drawn, which ensures absolute consistency across any system that ever tries to reconstruct it later. Section 3. Laws of adjacency. The corrected side lineage. Okay, so once you have one perfect jewel, the next logical step is to combine them, right? But you can't just throw them together randomly. No way. You have to follow what the packet calls the laws of adjacency. The rules create this strict, unbreakable dichotomy between the left side lineage and the right side lineage of the jewel. On the left side, the blue face and the green face must associate. On the right side, the red face and the orange face are paired. This rule dictates the mandatory physical adjacency for exactly how these pieces connect. And this brilliantly illustrates those visually mandated color pairings. Notice that thick, heavily drawn structural barrier right down the center of the diagram? The visual diagrams in the packet literally draw a wall between these pairings to make it unmistakable. Mixing them is strictly, explicitly forbidden. A red face must never pair with a green face. A blue face must never pair with an orange face. It is a hard-coded geometric law designed to maintain the integrity of the whole structure as it starts to multiply. Section 4. Scaling the architecture, tiling the void. So how does a single joule interact and scale up to tile these massive fields? The packet includes what it calls the 144 active joule table. And honestly, just look at these anchor names. Aluzrax, Thadlirio, Vadrant. They sound like something out of ancient mythology, don't they? But they actually operate strictly as binary logic gates, like yes, and, XOR, not, for rendering the field. Depending on local keys like a row index, layer index, or 5-phase offset, a rule activates deterministically, dictating exactly if a joule renders in the same orientation, inverted, or as a boundary. Let's move to and see how this builds when we apply those logic gates. Here we see those interaction states creating incredibly complex tessellations. Thanks to those logic gates and the strict side lineage laws we just talked about, these individual units lock together into perfectly aligned clusters. They interlock without ever breaking a single color or adjacency rule, maintaining that flawless phi-based geometry across the entire matrix. And they scale up to a truly massive degree. Get this. The packet outlines a density covenant. A full plan requires exactly 1,618,034 logical render instances. Sound familiar? Notice the digits in that number? It perfectly echoes the golden ratio phi, just scaled way up. That is wild. And again, the source vigorously insists that these logical render instances are display count units only. They are not source data counts, they are absolutely not anatomy measurements, and they are not clinical claims. Section 5. Reconstruction, not diagnosis, the true purpose. After going through all this intense math and geometry, we really have to ask, what is the actual point of all this? Well, the answer lies in what is explicitly forbidden. The document aggressively bans visual failures. We're talking no generic cube icons, no scattered marker confetti, and absolutely no single decorative jewels lacking tessellation. Crucially, a brain report without this exact geometry is considered a flat-out failure. It is hammering home the rigid boundaries, reinforcing that this is a strict, uncompromising computer vision rendering guide meant to endure over time. So, re-examining these dense MRI overlays with our completely new understanding really changes everything. We aren't looking at a medical analysis of a brain at all. We're looking at a highly complex display target. The entire purpose of this readability repair packet is to preserve this pure geometry so perfectly that another AI, or maybe a programmer months from now, can rebuild the structural joule system from scratch without needing to do any digital archaeological excavation. The MRI is literally just the backdrop proving the system's compatibility and dense scaling logic. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it forces us to ask a much broader question. If something that looks entirely like a functional medical tool is actually just a pristine, mathematically perfect rendering matrix, what other legacy systems out there are hiding purely deterministic beauty beneath a disguise of function? Thank you for joining me on this explainer, and I really encourage you to keep looking closer at the hidden structures all around you. Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're diving into a really fascinating explainer today, opening up a piece of documentation known as the Stage JR Readability Repair Edition packet. If you've got any interest at all in deterministic geometry, computer vision primitives, or just the incredibly strict, totally unyielding rules that can govern digital rendering, well, you are absolutely going to love this. We're taking a close look at the foundational blueprint of the 3D golden-rhombic joule. To crack this blueprint, we'll hit 5 key areas: the readability repair mission, the anatomy of the joule, the strict laws of adjacency, field tessellation and interaction, and we'll wrap it all up with the Stage F pilot render. All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the readability repair mission. So why does this specific repair document even exist in the first place? Well, it's basically here to save you, or maybe a future AI, from doing a tedious archaeological dig through legacy code. The tables in the older packets were just way too cramped. But right out of the gate, we need to establish the absolute golden rule of this repair. It does not diagnose, interpret, classify, or medically explain MRI data. Seriously, even if you see this overlaid on a medical scan, what we're looking at is pure deterministic geometry. These are strict visual display primitives, zero clinical claims whatsoever. Moving right along to Section 2, Anatomy of the Joule. Okay, to wrap our heads around the massive fields these units eventually create, we have to zoom way in and break down the fundamental building block itself. A 3D golden-rhombic joule is a 6-faced, completely deterministic display primitive. The governing mathematical law here is the golden rhombus rule. For every single major face, the long diagonal equals phi, 1.618033, and so on, and the short diagonal equals exactly 1. Because of these incredibly strict mathematical proportions, the packet practically shouts one essential fact at us. This is unequivocally not a generic icon, and it is absolutely not a cube.
Just look at the slant, the angles, and those precise diamond-like faces of the core geometry. Every single facet is governed by that exact golden rhombus rule we just talked about. It's a remarkably elegant, flawlessly reconstructible little unit.
And these faces, they are rigorously categorized in what's called the six-face canon. Now, I know, it totally looks like a bowl of programmer alphabet soup at first glance, but let's parse it out. FTY0 simply stands for front top yellow, facet 0, which sits right up at the crown. FRR1 is front right red. FLB2 is front left blue. Then underneath, acting as the receiver, you've got BBP3, or back bottom purple. And rounding out the back are BLG4, the back left green, and BRO5, the back right orange. By anchoring these really dense acronyms to their precise colors and lineages, it ensures the unit is 100% reproducible.
That brings us to Section 3, Strict Laws of Adjacency.
Now that we know the anatomy of a single joule, how do they actually link up within a local environment? Well, the adjacency laws here are binary and completely absolute. Notice the physical side lineages contrasted. On the left, we've got the left side lineage. That's the front left blue paired directly with the back left green. On the right, you've got the right side lineage, the front right red paired with the back right orange. These pairings are canonical. They are the bedrock deterministic foundation of how these jewels are legally allowed to align.
Which means, inherently, there are combinations that are strictly outlawed. Wrong side adjacencies are totally forbidden. You cannot pair the front right red with the back left green. No way. You cannot pair the front left blue with the back right orange. This dramatically highlights just how rigid and deterministic this whole system is. It can't just organically grow however it feels like. It literally has to follow the architectural law.
When a side receives a new jewel in its local environment, it can snap in with the same orientation, or it can be inverted. But it doesn't just guess. These rules activate deterministically. The system looks at local state keys, things like row index, column index, local brightness, and incredibly specific geometric variables, like the phi phase offset. Based on those exact keys, the jewel locks into a highly specific rotational state.
All right, Section 4, Field Tessellation and Interaction.
Zooming out from single units to the macro scale, what actually happens in larger clusters? Well, a jewel can inhabit a bunch of different interaction states. We mentioned it might be in the same or inverted orientation, but it could also be unbound, boundary active, dense field active, or emphasis active. And again, these states aren't random. They are entirely governed by a massive 144 active jewel table. That table uses operators like XR, NAND, and XNOR across 8 different anchor bits to precisely dictate behavior out in the field. And here is the payoff. Those rigid, micro-level interaction rules, they naturally cascade into these incredibly complex macro-level structures. What you are seeing are the corrected style variants and canonical tessellation. These are early volume proofs where you can clearly see the left side blue-green lineages and the right side red-orange lineages tiling together in perfect, legally compliant harmony. As the tessellation scales way up, we reach the stage C dense field and boundary wire evidence. Just look at how complex the spatial visualization is, conforming perfectly to the contours of the background. But I want to repeat our essential mantra right here. Even though this highly sophisticated wireframe is overlaid on a scan, it implies zero medical interpretation. This is purely a visual proof of the geometry's ability to map a boundary accurately using those deterministic keys we talked about.
And finally, Section 5, the Stage F pilot render.
This is where we showcase the ultimate render payloads and the seriously strict covenants that govern the final output. Just let this number sink in for a second. 1,618,034. That is the massive target number of logical render instances in the full plan. Notice anything about those digits? It directly echoes the golden ratio, phi, 1.618. It's an incredible scale, especially when you contrast it with a much, much smaller proof-of-concept pilot run that originally tested the system. For that Stage F pilot run, the system churned out exactly 40,451 total instances across a 3-page proof. Look at how those display count units are distributed. The vast majority of them, over 33,000 instances, fall into the dense active state. But you also see these very distinct allocations for boundary, sparse, emphasis, and reserve zones. Every single instance is accounted for, mathematically planned, and structurally justified. These visual compatibility plates basically serve as proof. This is the stage DR repaired compatibility evidence, assuring both the viewer and the programmer that the reconstruction preserves everything we've talked about today. The canonical colors are completely intact, the face ordering is perfect, and the render layers are precisely mapped. It's absolute proof that the readability repair mission was a success, without modifying a single source artifact. But to keep things this perfect, the packet fires off a strict list of forbidden visual failures. These are absolute deal breakers for any reconstruction. You cannot use generic cube icons. You absolutely cannot have what they call scattered marker confetti, where jewels just drift around unbound. You can't have wrong orange and green side placements or a reversion to old system dominances. These rules reinforce the incredibly rigorous aesthetic and structural standards of the whole plan.
Which leaves us with a really fascinating question. We've just explored this exhaustively documented, rigidly deterministic universe, a space where everything from adjacency to rotation to total instance counts is mathematically predefined. But as these frameworks are increasingly handed off to modern, often generative AI systems for reconstruction, what actually happens? What happens when a rigidly deterministic geometric system meets the fluid, highly unpredictable world of AI rendering? Can the canon actually survive intact without drifting into that scattered marker confetti? It's an amazing tension between strict mathematical law and modern computational interpretation. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep learning.
All right, let's just jump right in. Welcome to this explainer, where we are going to unpack a highly structured, honestly kind of mind-blowing blueprint for a deterministic computer vision display system. What we're digging into today is a very specific technical artifact. It's called the Stage JR Readability Repair Packet. Now, this isn't your everyday 3D modeling guide. It is an incredibly rigorous, programmatic rulebook that dictates exactly how simple geometric shapes interact to form massively complex digital structures, specifically a system known as the 3D golden-rhombic jewel.
So think of this packet as essentially a survival manual for a very specific digital ecosystem. It sets up a crystal clear mission for us to pass down this complex, rule-based geometry flawlessly. See, the original packet was technically correct, but the tables were just too cramped to actually use in practice. Hence this readability repair. They wanted to guarantee that some future AI, or a programmer named Dylan a few months down the line, wouldn't have to essentially dig through digital ruins just to figure out how these shapes were supposed to connect. They literally called it avoiding archaeological excavation, which I just love. To really wrap our heads around this whole system, we're going to break it down into 5 steps. Decoding the jewel packet, the anatomy of the jewel itself, the laws of assembly, scaling up to clusters, and finally, the final render pilot.
Okay, starting off with part 1, decoding the jewel packet. Here is absolutely the most crucial thing to understand right out of the gate. This system is entirely mathematical. The documentation hammers this home repeatedly to avoid any confusion. This packet describes geometry and rendering structure, and that is it. Now, later on in this explainer, we are going to be talking about these geometric fields being overlaid on brain scans, but they are strictly mathematical visualizations. They make zero clinical claims, no diagnosing, no interpreting, and definitely no modifying the original MRI source data. It is a strictly deterministic visual overlay, period.
Moving right along to part 2, anatomy of the jewel. Let's look at the core geometry.
So, our foundational unit, our atomic building block, is the 3D golden-rhombic jewel. Every major face of this 6-sided object is governed by the golden rhombus rule. What that means in plain English is that the long diagonal equals phi, that's roughly 1.618, and the short diagonal equals exactly 1. The documentation goes way out of its way to stress that this is a reconstructible, deterministic primitive, and it is distinctly not a generic cube. Every single angle is strictly dictated by that mathematical constant phi.
Because of those specific geometric properties, this primitive is totally different from a simple basic icon. It slants, it leans, and its faces have entirely different dimensions than a standard box. In its absolute standard orientation, what's called the canonical view, it has a distinct yellow top, red and blue sides, and green and orange flanking a bottom purple face. Every other rule in the entire system is born directly from this one specific orientation.
And those colors, they are definitely not just for show. The 6-face canon assigns exact RGB values, facet numbers, and very specific lineage roles to every single side. This ensures that no single jewel is ever just rendered randomly.
The precision here is intense. For example, FTY0 stands for front top yellow 0, which is assigned to the crown. FLB2 is front left blue 2. This creates an absolute unbreakable standard, where every single face has a known, mathematical, and visual identity.
Which brings us to part 3, the laws of assembly. What happens when these units start interacting?
The literal second you place two jewels next to each other, you trigger what's called the corrected side lineage law. This dictates a hyper-strict visual pairing. Basically, the left side of the jewel is composed of the blue and green faces, and the right side is red and orange. So, if you're building out to the left, you're interacting with blue and green. Building to the right, you're interacting with red and orange. It acts like magnetic polarities, keeping the orientation completely locked in 3D space.
That naturally leads us to the rigid rules of adjacency. A right-side face, like the red FR1, absolutely must share its edge with the other right-side face, which is the orange BR5. If you mess this up, say you accidentally mix that red right-side face with a green left-side face, that is literally called a forbidden visual failure. Doing that instantly breaks the system's deterministic logic. You really can't just mash these shapes together. Only certain mathematical connections are actually legal.
And man, the complexity goes way deeper than just matching colors. There's a 144 active Joule table that governs all these interaction states. It uses specific logical operators like XOR, XNOR, and NAND, alongside these wild, highly unique anchor names like Alujarex and Virid. That just goes to show the intensely programmatic nature of this render. It's pulling in local environmental data, like layer index and orientation bits, to determine exactly how a jewel behaves when a new one is placed next to it. It's not a static drawing, it's a living algorithm.
All right, part 4, scaling up to clusters, taking this from a single unit to a massive field.
They didn't just jump straight to rendering 1,000,000 units right out of the gate. The source packet follows a super strict chronological progression. They started at stage A with single adjacency proofs, literally just making sure 2 units could snap together without breaking the math. Then they evolved to stage BR to test different style variants, and finally hit stage C, proving the actual volume capability through dense cluster tessellation.
Because the foundational math of that golden rhombus is so flawlessly solid, these weird non-cubic shapes tile together without leaving any gaps or breaking the geometric canon. All those deterministic adjacency rules we just talked about execute perfectly across these complex tile variants, locking every single unit flawlessly into place while maintaining that strict side lineage law. Now, when you strip away those canonical solid colors and just look at the wireframe tessellation, it reveals the sheer mathematical density required here. It honestly gives you a true sense of the architectural volume. This stage C proof is the ultimate guarantee that if you render a massive dense field of these jewels, the internal geometry won't ever overlap, warp, or corrupt itself. It stays mathematically pure all the way to the core.
And finally, part 5, the final render pilot. Let's look at the stage F display target.
1,618,034. That staggering number is the full plan logical Joule render instance target, and if you're paying close attention, you'll notice an amazing Easter egg there. 1.618 million is a direct callback to the digits of the golden ratio itself, phi. It's a massive, massive display scale entirely governed by the rules we've been decoding.
But for the actual stage F pilot proof, they didn't render all 1.6 million at once. They used a smaller but still highly complex subset of exactly 40,451 instances. And these weren't just randomly thrown in. They were categorized deterministically. Over 33,000 formed the dense internal fields, while the rest mapped out boundaries, sparse sections, and emphasis points. And again, the packet makes sure to remind us, these are display count units, not medical counts.
The final validation is just visually and technically stunning. It's this incredibly precise, strictly geometric mesh overlaid perfectly on structural MRI data. The wireframes map out exact boundaries and transition flawlessly into fully rendered dense canonical jewels. It proves that the system acts as a universal spatial visualization tool, allowing computer vision to map complex 3D space using an interlocking golden ratio grid without ever altering the underlying scans.
But listen, this whole system absolutely falls apart if you get lazy. The packet explicitly forbids a whole list of failures. You cannot use generic cube icons. You can't just sprinkle what they call scattered marker confetti over a scan. You definitely cannot mess up the orange and green side placements, or just slap a single decorative jewel on a screen without tessellating it. And above all, no producing a brain report without the proper geometry.
This zero-tolerance strictness is exactly why this readability repair packet had to be drafted, to make sure future programmers get it exactly right.
Which brings us to the end of our explainer. I want to leave you with a thought. If a perfectly deterministic, phi-based geometric system can map wildly complex volumes this cleanly, acting as this beautiful, reconstructible visual language, what else could we map with it? Think about the limitless potential of deterministic geometry in the hands of tomorrow's computer vision systems. It's pretty wild to consider, right? Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the golden-rhombic jewel. I hope this gave you a really solid grasp on an incredibly fascinating topic. Keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next one.
Welcome back, focused learners. Today, we have a truly fascinating architectural puzzle to solve for this explainer. We're unpacking the 3D golden-rhombic jewel reconstruction packet, specifically looking at the Stage JR Readability Repair Edition. Now, if that sounds like a total mouthful, don't worry. Our task today is actually incredibly focused. We're going to decode a purely geometric, completely deterministic rendering primitive known simply as the jewel. It's honestly a masterclass in strict logical design, and I am so thrilled to guide you through exactly how it works. Okay, let's just dive right into this. When you first look at this dense, intensely structured geometric field overlaid on top of an MRI brain scan, it completely looks like advanced medical diagnostic software, right? Like it's mapping synapses or hunting for anomalies. It grabs your attention immediately because of the sheer complexity of that tessellated field. But to really understand this system, we have to completely shift our perspective on what it is we're actually looking at.
And that brings us to the most important subversion of expectations in this entire document. Actually, let me just read this quote directly from the source, because it's absolutely crucial. This packet describes jewel geometry and render structure only. It does not diagnose, interpret, classify, or medically explain MRI data. So this is going to be our core refrain today. Despite the background imagery, this is strictly a mathematical construct. It's a visual doctrine. There are literally zero medical claims, no clinical measurements, and absolutely no modifications being made to the source MRI data. We are talking about pure, unfiltered geometry.
So, here is our architectural blueprint for today. 1. The geometry of the jewel. 2. The six-face color canon. 3. Strict laws of adjacency. 4. Scaling up to tessellation. And finally, number 5, the reconstruction mandate. All right, section 1, the geometry of the jewel. Let's define this primitive.
So the absolutely crucial point here is this fundamental mathematical law. You see, the jewel is a display primitive made up of 6 faces, and every single major face is governed by the golden rhombus rule. This is not just some arbitrary shape they threw together. It demands strict, deterministic precision. The rule mandates that the long diagonal of the rhombus is equal to phi, and the short diagonal is exactly equal to 1.
And listen, when we say phi in this doctrine, we do not mean a rough ballpark estimate. The source material demands total adherence to this exact unforgiving value, 1.618033988794985. It's this epic authoritative mathematical constant that ensures every single generated primitive is geometrically perfect and infinitely scalable. And it does this without a single microscopic fraction of a rendering error.
Now here it is. This is the 3D golden-rhombic jewel. And I really want to hit this rhythmic motif from the source text because it's so vital. This is a 6-faced, reconstructible primitive. It is emphatically not a generic icon. And visually, you can just see that it is absolutely not a simple cube. It's a highly specific, slanted, deterministic object built purely on that golden ratio we just talked about.
Moving right along to section 2, the 6-face color canon. Let's look at the naming law. The designers established an exact nomenclature here, treating the faces almost like a very disciplined cast of characters. For example, the top face isn't just yellow. It is codenamed FTY0, or top yellow 0, with an exact RGB value of 255, 215, 0. Take a look at the others. Front right red 1, front left blue 2, right down to back bottom purple 3, which serves as the bottom receiver. The canon dictates not just the color, but the facet index and the exact RGB array. You absolutely cannot deviate from these specific values. They are the literal building blocks of the canonical unit. Now, what's really interesting about this is how these jewels actually sit in 3D space. You see, a jewel doesn't just sit there in a void. It exists in a local environment where it might receive a new jewel. The rules of interaction activate deterministically depending on the state.
For example, is the neighboring jewel in the same orientation, or is it inverted? The system reads local states, things like page index, layer index, and even local brightness, to determine exactly how the primitive behaves.
Okay, Section 3. Strict laws of adjacency. The corrected side lineage.
Let's visually isolate what the packet calls the corrected sideline law. Notice the left side and the right side rules here. The blue face, front left blue 2, must only pair and share an edge with the green face, back left green 4. That right there is your left side lineage. On the right side, the red face, front right red 1, is strictly paired with the orange face, back right orange 5. It's just this incredibly elegant logical sorting mechanism.
But listen, with strict rules comes strict punishments. The doctrine outlines very clear forbidden acts. You must never cross-pair wrong-side adjacencies. Red must not pair with green. Blue must not pair with orange. To do so violates the doctrine and completely breaks the mathematical continuity of the entire render. The system is entirely unyielding on this point.
Which brings us perfectly to Section 4, scaling up to tessellation. Let's see this procedural generation in action.
Chronologically, the packet walks us through the visual artifacts of this system. This is Stage A. You've got the master unit displaying the correct angle, basic adjacency, and the earliest evidence of tiling. You can actually see the logic just starting to test its boundaries here, placing units side by side according to those strict color pairing rules we just learned.
Step forward into Stage BR, and wow, we see the procedural generation really kicking into gear. The single primitives are grouping together into canonical style variants. They're forming these cohesive blocks, and because the underlying rules are perfect, the blocks just slot together effortlessly. It's like a giant puzzle where the algorithm is just repeating the deterministic logic over and over, building out massive volume. And then we hit Stage C. This is a jaw-dropping escalation. The shapes are deterministically forming these massive slice sheets. The packet mentions this is driven by a 144 active joule table, which uses logical operators, things like AND, XOR, and NAND, across different anchor bits to decide exactly where each joule renders. It's a beautifully complex matrix, yet it's running entirely on simple, foundational geometry.
And this brilliantly illustrates the whole shebang, the Stage C dense field and boundary wire evidence overlaid on the brain scan. Now that we know the rules, you can look at this image and understand exactly what is happening. Again, it is not an anatomy measurement, it is an algorithmic bloom. It's a purely logical render cascading across the space, completely indifferent to the medical data beneath it, yet visually interacting with the local environment.
To put this massive scale into perspective, just think about this number, 40,451. In the Stage F pilot proof render, that is the exact count of logical render instances across just 3 pages. And remember, the full planned scope targets over 1.6 million instances. The density is just staggering, and the whole thing is governed flawlessly by the golden rhombus.
Finally, Section 5, the reconstruction mandate, preserving the canon. The entire purpose of this packet is to set a definitive mandate. To pass the final validation page, a programmer must rigorously avoid these forbidden visual failures. Okay, so there can be no generic cube icons, no scattered marker confetti masking as data, no wrong orange or green side placements, no fallback to old color vox bound styles. You cannot just place a single decorative jewel without proper tessellation, and absolutely no brain reports lacking the proper geometry. It is an entirely uncompromising standard.
But when you actually follow all those rules, you get this, the final repaired compatibility plate. This visual evidence proves that the Stage AR readability repair is complete, it's canonical, and it is structurally sound. The colors are right, the angles are phi perfect, and the lineage laws are completely unbroken. It is a true mathematical triumph of computer vision reconstruction.
So, will you preserve the canon? Having walked through the golden rhombus geometry, the six-face color canon, and the strict laws of adjacency that build these massive deterministic fields, the packet leaves us with a pretty provocative challenge. If you were handed this blueprint months from now, would you have what it takes to rebuild the system from scratch without needing some sort of archaeological excavation? Well, that's something to think about. Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating architectural blueprint with me today on This Explainer. Stay curious, focused learners, and I'll see you in the next one.